All right, so welcome everybody. We are very excited to share with you our presentation today, get some more education into our lives, which is what we love to do. So I'm Mari, this is Dave with me. I think by now most of you know who we are, but for those of you who haven't joined, I run Emeritus Vineyards. Dave is our esteemed winemaker, among many other things that he does, but we are located in the Russian River Valley, in Sonoma County, California, which is a very cool climate. And we're talking about barrels today. And so each year we actually, not this year, but each year Dave goes out to Burgundy, usually with someone else from the winery, whether it's me or my father or Keith, Dave's assistant. And we actually work with our coopers and our Morandier to source oak barrels and to get them made to our specifications. So we have 3 very long-term relationships with incredible coopers in Burgundy that we work with to kind of make barrels to best fit our wines. So today we'll kind of dive through all of that and talk about a number of things about barrels. So anything, we're going to cover forest management a little bit, milling and aging staves, the actual fabrication of the barrels, and then the wine and oak interaction. And because we can't be experts on everything, we're just going to talk about French barrels today, French oak. So other questions, I mean, I think most people know kind of the archetype of the different areas, but we're just going to focus on the French processes today. Feel free to ask questions about other stuff as well. If we know them, we'll be happy to answer. Dave is a wealth of knowledge and does know a lot about other barrels from other areas, whereas my experience is all with French. So Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you because you're a history buff and you love talking about the history of the French forest.
Yeah, so what's fascinating about the French forest management is it's one of the longest agricultural management systems in the world. Early on, I think it was either Francis IV or somebody back in the Middle Ages set up the masters of rivers and forests in France. And so it was a way of keeping the forest from all being cut down for building and other uses. So they've been actively managed for hundreds and hundreds of years. Barrels became a thing for wine as wine was being transported around the world. People on those ships noticed that wine stored in barrel actually improved. I can imagine the wines that were made back in the day were pretty god awful as young wines, and so putting it in these barrels and transporting around the world actually improved the quality of wine. So again, that information got back to the powers that be in France, the nobles. They set up sort of active. It wasn't just the wealthy that were managing their own or forests. It's the government took over and was actively controlling and setting up controlled areas within France where they managed oak forests specifically for barrel building. There's a gentleman, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and there's actually a forest named after him that's still standing, that's at least 450 years old. And there's a barrel maker that actually uses some wood from that forest, and there's an eponymous barrel named after Monsieur Colbert. He's the one that set up the real forestry silviculture specifically for barrel making. And so this has been going on a long time. And as you can see from this map here, these are the various forests scattered around France that are very specific to barrel making. There are, I don't know how many million hectares of active forests within France, but it's a smaller percentage that are actually used for barrel production. Some are still privately owned, and a good portion are managed by the ONF, which is the French Office of Natural Office of Forestry in France. So it's a pretty, when you fly over France, as I hope a lot of you have, I'm always astounded by how much active forest land there is in France. It's not all cleared for fields and cities. It's very, very wooded country. And so depending on where you are within the country here, the type of wood that's grown, the species that predominate, the character of the wood, the industry that the barrels were used for is very, very different depending on where you are within France. So
there we go.
It's a fascinating business. It's a long-standing business. It's sustainable. There's a great picture of Bryce actually standing in a field that looks fairly open, but that is actually a 200-year-old stand of French oak trees that are about to be harvested that spring. So when forests are initially planted or seeded with acorns, the trees are very, very close to one another. And the idea there is that they all shoot up at the same time. They're all reaching for the light. They're actually crowding out one another so they have no side branches. So you want a tree 40, 50 feet tall with almost no side branches. They grow very, very close. And the first time I saw one of these, I didn't even recognize it as a forest. It looked like a dense thicket. They didn't even look like oak trees. They were so tall and skinny and straight. But that's a deliberate thing. It makes for trunks that eventually can be, a good portion of it will be suitable for barrels. But it takes a while before they actually get in there. Either private owners or the ONF goes in there and starts thinning these trees. And it's about 50 to 60 years before they get in there and start separating the trees and cutting down the ones that aren't suitable. After about 100 years, they go in about every 15, 20 years. They're removing side branches like that gentleman in the upper right slide is doing. It's really age and the girth of the tree that sort of sets the date for when a particular stand of trees is going to be appropriate for cutting down. And so it can be, in some cases, like for the Tronchet forest, which is highly prized, it's sort of the Grand Cru forest within France. Those trees have to be a minimum of 200 years old before they're felled. In other areas, like in Limousin, down in the south, where it's a little warmer, trees grow a little faster. They can reach a meter's girth or a diameter in 100 to 150 years. So it's pretty remarkable that, that tree again, or that slide where Bryce is standing, that is an active grove of managed trees, and it looks just sort of like an open meadow. Doesn't look like agriculture at all. It's beautiful. So I don't know if there are any questions at this stage.
Not yet, but I'd love for you to talk about the species a little bit.
Yeah, so there's two species that really predominate in the barrel forest, the actively managed barrel forest. There's Quercus robur and Quercus petraea. And the more we know about these two species, most forests have a mix of the two species within them. And once the trees have been managed and thinned and groomed, so to speak, for felling, it's pretty hard to tell one species from the other. But depending on where the stands are, the species might dominate, or there might be one species that's dominate over another. Others, there's almost equal proportions. And they're finding out now that that species actually drives more the flavor characteristic of the tree. The geographic location might set the kind of ratio of one species over another. It might affect the growth habits, the growth rings, but even the grain density they're finding is not such a huge indicator of how the ultimate flavor of the barrel and the interaction with the wine, which is pretty amazing because, most winemakers like myself, I've always assumed that grain density is the main driver, or, because that is how wood is selected once it does get to the cooperage. I saw a question there, but I wasn't able to catch it.
Yeah, I'll get it for you.
Okay.
Peter's asking, are barrels made from just one species, or can the staves be mixed?
They are often mixed. And I don't know anyone or any cooper that's actually be going out there and separating species by species. You'd almost have to do a little drilling into the log. And I've actually talked about that with our own coopers. We get to see those logs as they're felled. Our Marandier, when they bring their logs in, and we'll see a picture of that later, they could probably identify the tree by species at that time, but I don't know that anyone does. They're separated by forest, and then they're often separated by grain, but not necessarily by species, which I think the more we know, we need to go back and look at other things earlier in the process, I think. But they're just beautiful. The people that are out there and that know the silviculturalists and the people that spend their time in the woods, and the Marandier, the stave makers that we met, they're like characters out of a storybook. I mean, they're really crazy. They love the woods. They love being in the woods. They love trees. It's a really soulful profession.
Yeah, and for the privately managed forests, if you're talking about 150 years until it's harvested, that's multi-generations. So you're planting something that your grandkids are probably going to harvest.
Imagine going to a bank.
Pretty incredible.
Go to a bank and try to get a loan for that, huh?
Yeah. It'll be 150 years.
Yeah.
So it is incredible, and the people who are dedicated to this work, whether they work with the government or privately, are, you know, very, very passionate. They are as passionate about forest management as we are about wine. And
Yeah,
so
and
it's pretty incredible.
say something quickly about the 3 Cooper families that we work with. They really trust the entire process along the way.
Yeah.
You know, there are some cooperages that are fully integrated that even own stands of trees, and they make claims about, well, that's the only way you can effectively manage the whole process. But the families that we deal with kind of disagree with that, because, you know, the people that are doing the cutting of the trees, the people that are bringing the logs and seasoning them and splitting them, the cooper, you know, they all have their areas of expertise, and most of them have been, you know, doing it for 100 years or so. So they're really relying on the expert at each stage rather than trying to be fully integrated. And I think that's really kind of that's a cool thing as well. It's believing in the people that really have the passion for each step rather than trying to control all of it. So I really, just like we rely on our cooper relies on the Morandier relies on whoever's growing the forest and keeping it up to speed. So it's a nice thing.
And I thought I saw a hand up, but I think it went away. So feel free to raise your hand. We'll try the, you know, get your voices in if anybody is feeling it. So we'll keep going for now. But here is actually that next step. Once the trees are felled, this is in a Morandier's yard. So Dave, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, so the trees are generally right around mid to end of September. Both the private stands are sold off, as well as the French government auctions that occur. So the Morandier, or the stave maker, stave producer, they all get together in a room, and they've all visited the various stands of wood that are coming up for auction around France, and they're placing bids on the stands. And I was reading an interview with a guy that actually goes out and does the you know, the cruising of the forest to determine how much wood or how many barrels might be in a stand. So as they go into the forest, they measure up about 1.33 meters, you know, which is about chest height. And then they look up to where the first branches are, and they do a little quick calculation for how that straight portion of the tree, and then how many of those trees have, you know, how many board feet might come out of that, knowing full well that once those trees are cut, that only about 20% of that straight section is even suitable for barrel making. So it's remarkable, you know, the amount of time and skill and money that's spent to purchase this wood, knowing that only a small percentage is going to make it into the barrel. But so you can see when the trees are felled between October and March or so, they're brought to the yard. If it's raining, actively raining, they'll just leave them out in the yard stacked up. These blue markers on the logs there is delineating that this is I think a tronchet stack. So that wood came from a very particular forest. If it's a little bit drier, if it's a drier winter, they might actively sprinkle the logs with water to keep them fully hydrated, keep them from splitting prematurely. The seasoning is somewhat beginning now, but most of the seasoning occurs in the wood after it's been split into the smaller stave pieces. So those, Mara, do you have anything to add to that stage? You've visited that stage with me and seen that.
No, I mean, it's pretty incredible to see them all piled up like that. You feel like a very small little person.
Yeah, the log is enormous.
Yeah, and so
that lower right-hand log is probably 3.5 feet across or more. That lowest one on the right side. So the logs are then brought to the mill area. They're cut into about 1 meter lengths, a little longer than what a stave would be. And that's what's happening in that upper right slide. They're cutting it across. You know, already the Morandier is kind of gauging, you know, how good a piece is. You know, they're looking for things like knots or checkered areas or little honeycomb spots in the wood. They can look at the end of the log and tell you, oh, this is going to be suitable for staves or not. And they're hoping that, you know, a good majority of it is. They have their little piece of chalk out there, always marking on the ends to kind of determine where they might end up splitting the piece. And so once they're in those 1 meter lengths, they're split generally in quarters with a giant hydraulic maul. And I think you're going to see some photos of that in a little bit, some video actually. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So that thing has been initially split into quarters, and now he's splitting it into smaller pieces. And when you're standing there next to that, you can actually smell the wood. It has a really unusual kind of acrid, sweet smell. You know, the big guys that are good can actually pick up a log and smell which forest it's from, which I think is pretty amazing. they take then those smaller pieces and they run them through a saw to kind of create sort of a proto stave. And that guy that's running the saw, he's not just cutting willy-nilly. He's actually looking very, very carefully, determining, he has to look at the grain, he has to look at the width. They're not all cut to the same width at this stage, because if any of you have ever looked at the end of a barrel, you notice that some staves are wider, some are narrower. And so there's probably a minimum width that can be used as well as a maximum width, but that's what that gentleman is doing.
Yeah. And then it's up to the coopers to match each piece together to make a complete barrel. Right.
And so then once that first cutting is done, it goes through sort of a milling thing that gives you the rough stave. So it's giving you a rectangular flat piece that can be stacked up for the seasoning process. And so we mentioned that only about 20% of the wood from that straight segment of the trunk gets used for the barrel staves. The sawdust is used for fuel. Other thing gets used for veneer. Some of it's used for furniture. So it really, so you can see that gentleman there is stacking up some stave wood. It's at that stage, it's still fairly rough on the exterior. It hasn't been planed down, hasn't been beveled, hasn't been trimmed on the end. So
yeah, they're literally just making, little, what we would think of as like short 2x4s.
Yep. And so those are still at this stage, they're, it's tracked. Our coopers can track a barrel all the way back to the stand of the forest that it was cut from. And so each batch comes through, it's stacked by the forest. It's not yet being sorted for grain density. So this is just the first stage. This wood is green. Those staves are very, very heavy. They're fairly saturated with water. It's raw wood. They smell great, but when you pick them up, they're quite heavy, and you wouldn't be making a barrel out of that wood yet.
And that's where seasoning comes in.
There you go. Look at that. So the stack on the left is been sitting there for, close to 3 years. The stack on the right is brand new. The stack on the left has had extra staves added to it. If that had not happened, if you just put two stacks side by side, one brand new, one the same number of staves, but 3 years out, it would be about a foot shorter than the other stack. So what's happening, this is all done out of doors. At least the fine coopers are doing it that way. You can accelerate it by putting it in a kiln and watering it, but all the coopers we work with, and the majority of the ones that are people that are making fine wine are using this outdoor seasoning method. So you can see the staves are sort of stacked at a crisscross fashion to allow water, a certain amount of sunlight, air flow through it. For dry summers, sometimes they might actually set up sprinklers over the top, but mostly they're relying on rainfall in the winter and drying out in the summer. And so that sort of hydration, dehydration process gently sort of wrings the wood out. It's leaching things called hydrolyzable tannins that can be very, very harsh. It's removing this whole set of compounds called coumarins that are very, very bitter. There's sort of active washing and leaching of the wood, and then there's microbially stuff going on in the wood with molds and bacteria that are actually also transforming some of the chemistry of the wood into something that's more suitable for making barrels. If you were to make a barrel out of that wood on the right, it would be so harsh and green and woody and planky tasting that the wine would be awful. So the seasoning process is a really important part of making the wood ready for coopering into a barrel and making it ready to receive wine.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is...
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
I was just going to say where the location of where the seasoning happens can make a difference on the flavors and kind of seasoning of the wood. So I remember we used to season wood at a Morandier's yard, and we ended up liking a lot more the wood that was seasoned at our coopers in Burgundy. Yes. Yeah. And so, just that small of a difference, it's only, maybe 100 miles away, but that made a big enough difference on the flavors that we were getting in the barrels that we decided to, change our barrel program.
Yeah, it turned out the only real difference was the nighttime temperatures were the same, the summer heat was the same, the winters were the same, but it was the center of France had less variation in humidity, and so we weren't getting that kind of drying out, rehydration drying out, and it wasn't seasoning the wood well enough. So as soon as that wood was moved to Burgundy, where the cooperages are located, it made all the difference in the world. And we'd already been making barrels from the same forests that had been season the entire time. So we knew right away kind of what we liked. And yeah, it's amazing.
All right, we'll go on. So everything is now seasoned. So now we're going on to making barrels.
So you can see the end of that little stave there. The edge, it's already been kind of trimmed to be slightly beveled on either side of the stave. We're looking at the very end of the stave piece there. You can see how tight the grain is. The rings are kind of going diagonally, and they're very, very tight. That wood now is probably half as heavy as it was when it was a green stave. And so at this stage, usually when they come into the cooper, they're, again, they're still separated by forest, but a number of our coopers, well, actually all three of them, will do a hyper selection by grain and just the prettiest pieces. So our D&J barrels, d'Argos Jaglé, they have a hyper selected barrel called the Marcel Cadet, which is named after the grandfather who founded the cooperage. And so this wood is coming into the cooper, and they're doing one more sorting of the wood. And
just to remind you what it looks like when it comes in, it looks like this picture on the left when it comes, or the stack on the left when it comes in. And
even sticking on this slide, Mari, when that wood first arrived, that stack on the right, when that first arrived at the cooperage, it wasn't stacked that way. So they're stacked tight together. And so there's a process. There's usually 2 to 4 people standing there unstacking each stack. They're eyeballing each stave for any defect, and then they're rejecting staves that aren't going to be suitable to produce a stave from. And so they keep all these records. They will reject an entire batch of wood if the flaws exceed a certain percentage. So they have very stringent control even at that stage before they bothered to season the wood. So by the time it's in this stage, it's already been sorted to make sure that the piece is going to be turned into a good stave.
Yeah.
And there you have it. That's like a near perfect stave. So there's
and this stave is showing after it's been milled into staves. So it comes in really dark, it gets resorted by grain, and then it goes through a milling process to create that bevel on the side, to give it a little notch on the ends, and to strip off all of that dark wood.
Yep, a slight bow to it. So then when you do bend it into a barrel, it doesn't crack. And Mari mentioned the color. So that oxidized sort of grayish exterior of the wood has all been milled off. So it looks like fresh wood again. It's real pretty and blonde. It's gorgeous. Smells great. If any of you haven't been to a cooperage, I highly recommend it. It'll open your mind to, like, you'll find so many familiar smells that you smelled in wine over the years. So it's really,
it's incredible. So
the process of becoming a barrel is, that sorting. Here we are. This is on the very beginning of it. They put on where they're called, these aren't even the finished hoops. These are ones that they use only on the wood for the bending and toasting process. So they're creating what's called the rose, which is such a pretty name, and they look just like a flower. And they drive hoops on just one end only. And you can see
the process of lining them up, knowing that every piece is, different. There is somebody that is sitting there lining up every stave to make sure that it's going to make a watertight barrel at the end of the day, which is also pretty incredible.
Yeah, this funny flat gauge where they lay all the staves in, and it's the last couple staves. They always have to make sure they have a really wide stave somewhere in the mix for the bung, because it has to be a bigger stave than all the other staves. And then it's that last stave that they place in that kind of bracket that creates the actual width. And they're amazingly uniform, given that they're just a bunch of chunks of wood thrown together. It's really quite pretty. So that way, when they random,
it's random. There's not, there's stave 1 and stave 2 and stave 3 and stave 4, and they're, stave 1 is this width and stave 2 is this width. They are just natural what is given and then matched up to make it work.
So they drive these sort of temporary hoops on pretty tight, so the rose doesn't fall apart when it's moved on to the bending phase. And so bending, it takes heat to bend wood. Wood is made up of lignin. Lignin is the structural component of wood. When you heat it either with fire, with infrared, with steam, or with boiling water, it softens the wood well enough that it can be bent. And so what you're seeing there is that there's the slide in the middle is there's a fire that's strictly set for bending, and they're spraying the exterior of the wood to keep it from cracking. There is a chain at the bottom of that, or a cable at the bottom of that barrel that is slowly tightening. Once this gentleman determines that the wood is soft enough, this sort of noose slowly tightens around the base of it, and it bends those staves onto themselves to create the actual build shape of the barrel. And remember
and
those.
Yeah, that's what you can see happening in that video on the right. I'll keep playing
Yeah.
it because it's pretty short, but that just slowly collapses around it to get that bend.
It takes about 15 minutes or so. If you do it too quickly, the staves will snap. It's pretty amazing. And so this would be considered a fire bent barrel. So it's using a brazier full of oak chunks. You can see that bin in the back. Those are, again, the pieces of staves that are cut off. Everything gets used. So that's used for the fire to actually bend the barrel and for toasting later on. So this is using fire to bend the barrel. One of our 3 coopers, Dargaud Jéglet down in the Macomb, they use a boiling water bath and steam to help soften the wood to bend it. And the end result is quite different, and they both have advantages and disadvantages for sure.
So here is that water bending process.
Yep. So this thing has just come out of the steamer. So you can see the wood is just giving off all kinds of steam. And so in this case, you're putting the noose around the top of it and slowly tightening it. That thing smells so good at that point too. It's just, it's remarkable. So it's been in a boiling water bath for like 10 minutes or so. Everything's timed very, very carefully. And then there it goes. See, it's slowly tightening it. That's great. Now he's lowering a fresh rose into the boiling water bath. And they put like 2 on top of one another, I think, in each of those. And this particular cooper, the gentleman who owns it, Jean Marcel, he and his son is an engineer, and they've built a lot of this equipment and trademarked it for the sort of mechanization for certain aspects of barrel making. So much of it is still done by hand, but in order for things to be very, very uniform and for safety purposes, they've developed a lot of equipment for the mechanization of barrel. They use lasers on the exterior of the barrel to actually, for an indicator, like a laser thermometer, so they know how long the piece of wood has been on the fire. Badminton. Someone mentioned that the roses look like badminton birdies. Yeah, they really do.
They do.
It's actually my favorite stage of barrel making. I think if somehow you could make wine in something that looked like that, it'd be very, very cool. They're beautiful things. Just sculpturally, they're really, really pretty. When you see a room full of roses, it's really nice.
Yeah, and so there are, I don't even want to say subtle, but there are differences in the way that the barrel interacts with your wine, whether it's been water bent or fire bent. There's just different characteristics of the barrels. And we choose to use coopers that utilize both methods of bending. No matter what, all the barrels get toasted, whether, you can go from light to really dark, and we'll get there in just a minute. But it is really interesting the way that those processes really impact the final result of the wine too.
So that slide on the right is actually a finished barrel. It's been toasted, and the final, those are the dressy hoops, the final, so you can see the galvanides are all polished, and that they're being driven on there by that hydraulic hoop driver. You can do it by hand and with a sledgehammer and a little tool. It's brutal work. I mean, the guys that work in coopers that do it by hand have like one giant arm, and it's really remarkable. It's very loud too. So this machine just slowly forces them on. It's very, very quiet activity.
Yeah. I was actually going to say it's similar to what Bryce and this guy are doing.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Driving the work hoops on to get the roses. So now that everything is bent and we have the, form of the final barrel, now it's time to toast. And
these barrels don't have heads on yet. The heads are made in a different part of the factory. Yeah.
So everything is toasted with fire. I've never heard of a cooper toasting with anything else. I worked with a barrel that was done with infrared, which was pretty amazing. And so
they did both sides, so the entire stave had kind of the same. There was no gradient. It was pretty unusual. So that top left slide is the fire bending. Or rather, that's probably at either Rousseau or Raymond. So our 3 coopers are Tonnellerie Raymond just north of Burgundy. Tonnellerie Rousseau is a little further up Burgundy, and then Dargaud-Jaglay is down in the Macon, which is about an hour and a half drive south of Burgundy. And so the bottom slide is, I mentioned the lasers. If you look really carefully, that you would see little red dots on all of those barrels lined up. And so that's a temperature. There's actually a digital readout up high in the room where each of the barrels' temperature is monitored. And so the person toasting is watching that the whole time, and then they flip the barrel over after a certain amount of time at a certain temperature. The barrels above that are more just done, it's done by aroma, it's done by, the guy putting his hand on there. Some of them have infrared thermometers in their hand. Some of it's done visually. It's all very touchy-feely and very instinctual. Yeah. But man, at this stage, again, the whole room is incredibly perfumed with all the smells that you associate with toasted oak.
And there's so many different, types of toast. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with light, medium, heavy, but, I always joke that you can get as many different toast orders as you could, coffees at Starbucks. There's 1.5 million ways to order your toasting. Do you have medium toast long minus, medium toast long plus, medium toast short? There's a lot of variation, but so much of it is done by the human hand and eyes and senses that, cooperage will typically have their own version of what medium is based on the people that they have working there who've also, then trained there and come up, making those barrels, versus the next cooperage down the road, their medium's going to be a little bit different because they have a different person who's, been working there and training there and making those barrels for a long time. So everything is a little bit different, and it's really an ongoing process, collaboration with your cooperages to really get the barrels that you want for your wines. And I know, we'll kind of get into that a little bit more, but the way that Dave and his crew and that we all taste with our coopers, and when we're in Burgundy, go and taste with their clients in Burgundy as well, to really understand the interaction of the barrels with the wine, is as much, an art as anything in winemaking. It's pretty incredible.
And so the three coopers that we are working with have very, very different approaches.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of the barrel making used to be like every village had a barrel maker. And so the barrel making for the wine industry has evolved for the region where the wine is made. And so, a medium toast in Burgundy would be very, very different from something that might have been used in Bordeaux. Not only because of the origin of the forest, but maybe where the forest came from required a little bit more toasting or seasoning in order to make the wine or the barrel appropriate for the wine. So a lot of this is developed hand in hand. These days, most cooperages come to you and say, "What do you want?" And yeah. I'm more inclined to say, "Well, what do you got? What is your style, and what have you done? What have you learned over the years?" And I would rather have 3 barrels that are really, really different to complement one another than have it your way kind of thing. It's more interesting to see what the family's history is in making a barrel and what they believe. They know their wood, and they know what brings the most out of their wood. So it's amazing to work with these 3 family-owned cooperages that just know the business inside and out. And then they're really great. They have great palates, so they taste our wines and they're able to kind of tweak it to our specifications as well.
Yeah, and that's what's great about our relationships, that not every winery is as lucky to have the history that we do with our family coopers.
Yeah.
So then barrels are made, they get shipped to the wineries, and this is how Dave keeps track of barrel and wine interactions. And this is really what it's all about at the end of the day. It's incredible how these barrels are made, and every time I see it, it blows me away. But at the end of the day, we're there because we make wine. And so when it comes back to us, how do we learn from our barrels and our wine, and how do we develop kind of a lexicon around these barrels and these coopers and what we're looking for and how they interact? And so I will let Dave take this away and explain it, but this is a pretty detailed and precise way that we're able to keep track of everything.
So this chart kind of comes about from just months and months of tasting individual barrels blind and making notes on what we perceive aromatically and texturally and from a flavor standpoint. And so my assistant and I have a pretty consistent way of describing things. So, you know, his version of floral, I know, is pretty much the same as mine. We're talking about the same thing. So it was pretty easy to come up with a set of aromatic notes and textural and flavor notes that we know we would use consistently over and over and over again. And so I just made note of how often we used certain words to describe a certain barrel. And we wouldn't know until after we tasted the barrel or reveal what the barrels were. And so patterns start to emerge. And so the red areas are where we used a certain term the most, and then the second would be in the orange. And so I found it, once we sorted all the data and put like not only the producer, but forest or toasting method, that first upper section is an Allier light barrel from, I can't even see if it's the same producer.
We've got Ramon and Rousseau.
Yeah, so they're two different Coopers, but it's Allier and light. And you'll notice that aromatically, they're kind of dry with a little floral note. And then in the mouth, there's some impactful notes. The flavor is very kind of concentrated in a certain area in the mouth. Whereas if you go from the light to the medium Allier, which is the next kind of grouping below, the flavors, the aroma shifts to a darker, spicier thing. You get more of the vanilla caramel, which is what you might expect anyway from the higher temperature or longer time on the fire. The vanillin is a byproduct of heating the lignin in the wood. So it's a degradation product from heat. And caramel, you know, there's a lot of sugar in woods. There's something called maltol that gives you that sort of buttery crust and caramel note. That is produced from heat. So the more you toast it, or the longer you toast it, it stands to reason you would get more of that. And sure enough, it sort of appeared magically in our blind tasting. And then look what happens to the mouth. The mouth shifts all the way back to this sort of creamier, richer mouthfeel. And that's something we observe often, is that a lighter toast barrel is really about structure and less about flavor. And then a more toasted barrel, or even a medium toast, pushes the kind of palate to the back. It can be useful for a wine that feels tannic already on its own to kind of sauce it over with some creaminess. If you have a wine that's already pretty fatty and a little bit sloppy feeling, you can put it in a lighter toast barrel and it provides some real structure and impact. So it's remarkable how this kind of all sorted out after months and months, and it's kind of like a little heat map for flavor and toasting. And
also from forest.
Yes, exactly. So we actually were working with this one particular forest. I think it was Bertrange. And I don't know if that slide, if you can't really
go. It kind of got cut off in my.
Yeah. So if you notice that the aromas or the flavors that kept coming up with that forest were sort of harsh, green, woody. And so I used to love that forest, and I was really drawn to it because it's kind of a smaller section in this one area. And we decided, you know what, it's not really appropriate for our wine. So we stopped buying that wood from the Cooper that was able to actually separate it out. So we don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And then we've also discovered some others that we didn't know anything about. So this is kind of a very useful way of, you know, getting over your bias and also confirming some things you kind of know sort of intuitively.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. I love this slide. It's hard to read off the bat, but I think once you see it, you kind of understand it better. And, you know, you can also see the block and clone that we are sampling each from. So, you know, there's a range of different clones that are going into the Vosges forest, for instance. Mm-hmm. But no matter what, there are certain things that keep coming up. And so that's when you say, okay, that's probably from the wood, right? So that's how Dave and Keith are really able to drill in and identify what characteristics is the wood bringing versus, you know, if I'm tasting 8 different blocks from one type of barrel, there's obviously going to be a lot of variation in those barrels to begin with, just given all the differences. But what are the things that tie them together? And that, you know, stands to reason that it's likely coming from the barrel in some way. So, all right, that is kind of our last slide. So I want to open it up to questions. You can raise your hand, you can type them in the Q&A, the chat. If there aren't any questions, I mean, that just means that Dave, you did such a great job explaining everything, which is great. But I have a feeling that some people have some. So we'd love to hear from you. But while we're waiting for that, I'll just give a plug for our next month. We'll do this on September 2nd. If we have to postpone due to harvest, we'll definitely send out a note to let you all know. It does look like the harvest is going to start early, so TBD. But our next topic is going to be discussing closures and the impact that it has on wine. So different types of cork, screw cap, etc. And we'll obviously dive in a little bit more on what we do and the different corks that we've experimented with as well. Samantha is asking, do you use different sizes of barrels? That's a great point that we haven't even really touched on, is all the different barrel sizes.
We have a few puncheons in-house. Puncheons are 500 liter, 132 gallons. We were using those mostly for our Blanc. Occasionally we ferment some of our rosé. They're really great for wine that you want to minimize the kind of surface area interaction. There's a little less oxidation. Obviously there's a less barrel flavor influence. Yeah. Ours were quite old. They were not really delivering any flavor to the wines. We didn't really want that for the Blanc and the rosé. I used to love those for Syrah, making Syrah and Malbec and things where, again, you want a softer approach to the wine. Zinfandel is great in puncheon. I would say 99% of what we have here are all the 225 liter barrel here, the 60 gallon barrel or 59 gallon barrel.
Yeah. And then there's also, options to ferment in barrel versus in tank. There is a lot more that goes into oak decisions than just what we've discussed here. We really just wanted to share the barrel making process, but we can definitely dive into some of these oak discussions as well, because then there's also how many times do you use it? Are you using it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 5 times? What are you looking for? And how does that change and evolve as barrels get older, what they're imparting?
Yeah, and even, just getting back to selection of barrels, what is a winemaker looking for? Again, your style of winemaking will determine a lot of ways whose barrel you buy and the toasting level that you might request. So if you're a brand who the barrel is a very important part of the character of your wine, then you're going to want barrels that are more impactful, in terms of the forest that you use, smaller size versus larger size, maybe heavier toasting. It tends to really generate a lot of flavor as opposed to providing structure. If you're, kind of depends on your whole winemaking process, what barrel you end up selecting. In our case, we're only at about 1/3 new oak generally in the majority of our wines. We're looking for sort of structure that supports the wine. We're not looking for huge oak flavor and aroma impact necessarily. Again, at 1/3, you can have a pretty strong barrel and it ends up being diluted out by a 1- and 2-year-old barrel with a 3-year rotation. So you don't want a barrel that's so subtle it's not worth buying new barrels. Right. So there's lots of considerations when trying to figure out which barrels you want to use for your wine. I saw a question.
I've got a few more that's come in. So let's see. Michael loves the chart. So he's asking, when you reuse the barrels, do you maintain the clones used? So are you putting the same blocks into the same barrels every year?
No. So after we empty the barrel, whether it's a brand new one, 1-year or 2-year, we rinse the barrel out with warm water for 15 minutes or hot water. This knocks off all the tartrates, it gets all the yeast out, and then it goes onto a barrel steamer. So that we steam for 10 minutes. Then we put the bung back in the thing, and as it cools, it creates a vacuum that actually pulls the wine that's sucked into the wood. It pulls it out into the steam that's cooling. So when you flip the barrel over after 10 minutes, pull the bung out, even though the barrel looked clean, all this dark, deep red kind of purplish liquid comes out. So essentially you're wringing the barrel out every year. And so it would be a nightmare to try to track. We have 11 clones and 30 blocks, and trying to find the one used barrel that we used last year would just be too much work. So thank goodness.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of interaction between the old wine, basically none between the old wine and the new wine that's going in.
Right. But if you didn't steam it, that old wine residue would actually rehydrate and go back into the new wine. And you can taste wines out there sometimes that have that kind of old barrel, old wine flavor. And that's from barrels that just aren't cleaned appropriately.
Yep. So two questions on the same vein, so I'll just throw them to you together.
Sure.
So are any Pinot winemakers using American oak? Why or why not? And then have you experimented with barrels other than French, and what was the results?
I personally have not used American oak in Pinot Noir, but I know a number of brands that do. One exclusively uses Hungarian oak, a friend of mine. And so, again, it depends on what you want out of the barrel into your wine. American oak, being a different species, has much more extractable material, and that material, I mean, we all know what whiskey tastes like. That's American oak. And white oak has much higher concentrations of flavorants. And during the degradation process and toasting process, those things break down, not only releasing things that we associate with American oak, high in vanilla and sometimes dill, but also a lot of sugar. So American oak can give you kind of a perception of sweetness often. And so I just find that overwhelming for Pinot Noir. I don't want anyone to say, gee, I love the barrel you use in your Pinot Noir. People shouldn't be noticing the barrel in our wine. That's my opinion for the style that we make. Other maybe bigger styles of Pinot Noirs can get away with some American oak because there's so much, maybe a riper style is something where an American oak it would
it's
be
just
appropriate.
more appropriate, yeah.
Right, and there are parts of the U.S., Pennsylvania, cooler areas, and the American oak barrels have come a long, long way, and they're very attractive for their pricing. They're about a quarter the price of a French oak barrel. It's just, and with Pinot Noir, it's not something that you see very often necessarily. But I've used it very successfully in lots of other varieties, Cabernet and Syrah and Zinfandel.
Yeah, and so you touched on it, but there's another question, difference in cost, American, French, Hungarian, Slovenian, etc. So yes, there is a big difference in cost.
Yeah. So part of it's due to the structure of American oak allows it to be cut with a saw, even at that very, very early stage. Remember the slide where that wood had to be split? And there's so much handwork that has to be done. French oak has kind of continuous running straws through the entire length of the wood. And if you break any of those straws, then the barrel will leak. In American oak, there are these little little segments within those straws that prevent liquid from siphoning from one end of the stave to the other. So if you cut through one of those accidentally with a saw, it doesn't matter. So there's savings that can be happening early in the stage of producing the barrel that are huge cost savings. And then, I mean, American oak is here in this country. It doesn't have to be transported whole across the ocean. So there's big, big differences.
Yeah. Another good question. So during the shipping of new barrels, are there concerns regarding humidity, temperature, or just, I would add, other concerns about transit?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
So we've had barrels, I've come across barrels that are corked, that have gotten TCA somehow into the wood. So either the container that it was shipped in had it in the wood planks on the floor. I mean, a lot of oak is treated with, or a lot of wood is treated with pentachloris thing to keep it from rotting. If that gets in under the wrong, with the wrong mold, it can make TCA. So that TCA can go in barrels that are in that container. I guess when stuff is shipped across the ocean, you kind of have to take whatever weather comes. They don't dry out so much. Usually when they arrive here, they're in good shape. The hoops aren't rattling. Oftentimes, when the barrel's stored in the warehouse on this end, if the warehouse isn't humidified, and you get your barrels late in the season, they can be kind of rattly and you have to rehydrate them. You just steam them or fill them with warm water or swell the heads by rotating them end to end to kind of swell the barrel back up. But you can have a barrel that's completely fallen apart, being too dry, and you can put it back together and rehydrate it.
Yeah. A lot of it is typically barrels do have to be conditioned in some form when they arrive at their final destination, whether that's a rinse out or something a little bit more dramatic. It's gone across the ocean, so there's usually a little bit of something to be done.
Right. So we order our barrels in March and April, and we received our third shipment of barrels about 3.5 weeks ago.
Yeah. So it does take a while. And then, of course, Coopers are pretty much making them to specifications, or to order. So that just takes a little while, and they have clients all over the world typically.
Yeah, and they're making our barrels in the spring, so in order to get them here in time for the Burgundian barrels. They can make them just like practically the day before, and ship them across the street if they have to. So they've actually set their businesses up quite well for global production.
Yeah. So I think that's all the questions. I'll remind you again next month. If we do have to postpone it, we'll let you know, but we're hoping. Oh, one more question came in from Frank. What are the prospects of French oak staves being shipped to local coopers? So having them actually constructed here is what I'm understanding that question to be.
That's actually a great question. I'm surprised more don't do that, because you can obviously get a lot more staves into a container than full barrels. A shipping container can hold about 150 barrels, where you could probably build 500 or more barrels out of a container full of staves. I know Nadalier cooperage up in Calistoga, they make a portion of their barrels here. They actually assemble them here from staves that are shipped over. Maybe Demtos does that as well. I'm not sure. I don't want to say, but there are a few that have operations here in the States that they actually assemble them here. So yeah, not all cooperages. Many of these cooperages are really small, and they can't really afford to have a whole other operation on this side of the pond. So
yeah, for sure. And also I would say some coopers really have their labor, their processes and their workshops all set up, and to be able to recreate that across the world with the skill, the oversight, making sure it adheres to their styles and specifications would be challenging, to say the least, especially for those, small family operations that maybe would also struggle to get the capital to do such a thing.
Yeah.
But it does happen. All right, one more question. Having made beautiful Pinot Noirs 30 years, do you still have a favorite cooper?
Yeah, I don't want to say that because I love all three of our coopers. I might say that there's a particular forest that often when if we're tasting wines blind and I describe it as noble or sophisticated with the sort of a length, and like if I had to pick one barrel, more often than not, regardless of the cooper, it's from Tronchet. And so there's something and there's a reason you pay a premium for that wood. And our coopers are actually allowed to still forest designate. There's something about that wood repeatedly that just keeps coming up. And that's not to say sometimes it would be better to use a Vosges that's very floral and spicy, or an Allier that's creamier and rich. But there's, I guess, if one source had to, I can only buy one barrel from one source, it would be from that forest, from any of the coopers that we work with.
I'd also just add that the coopers that we work with and many other coopers in France are actually, there's like a certificate of origin type of thing that they have to certify that their products are what they say that they are from each forest, but also 100% French oak, that they're actually making a true product from France. And not every cooperage adheres to that. It's expensive to be certified. It's, more paperwork, et cetera. But it is really important to the coopers that we work with, being, really artisanal, that they have that kind of stamp of certification on their products to say, we are what we say we are. So that's even just another layer of, are you going to work with a cooper that's certified? How much do you trust if they're not? There are all sorts of things. There's a lot of oak being shipped out of France that probably couldn't have been cut down, just knowing. But we will leave it at that today, and we look forward to seeing you next month, if not in 2 months or some other time if we postpone. But I hope everybody has a great day, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much for joining.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
See ya.